Hey everyone, and welcome back to Too Lazy to Read. You already know how this works. We take those books everyone keeps telling you should read, and we break them down so you get all the good stuff without, well, all the reading. Today we're diving into a classic that's been making people laugh and think for decades. The Peter Principle, Why Things Always Go Wrong, by Lawrence J. Peter and Raymond Hull.
It's a fascinating book. It's all about this idea that people in organizations just keep getting promoted until they finally reach a level where they just aren't good anymore. It's called the Peter Principle, and it explains so much about why things go wrong, especially at the top.
Yeah. It's like you ever had a boss who seems totally clueless?
Yeah.
Like, how do they even get there? This book won't just explain why. And the authors start by telling all these funny stories about incompetence that they've seen in everyday life. Like, remember when you bought that cheap stapler and it jammed constantly?
Oh, yeah, I've been there.
Or that time you tried to assemble furniture with instructions that made absolutely no sense?
Boy, I've been there.
It's those little moments of like, wait, who designed this? You know, those moments that make you realize that incompetence, it's everywhere.
It really is. But Peter and Hull take it a step further. They use those relatable examples to show how this plays out in big organizations, too.
Organizations. So they introduce us to the Peter Principle by taking us to a pill-rolling factory. Imagine the most amazing worker there. Super fast, never makes a mistake. Let's just call him Dave. Dave gets promoted to foreman because he's so good at rolling pills. But being a great pill roller
doesn't automatically make you a great leader?
Exactly. Dave might be awesome at the hands-on stuff, but terrible at managing people or scheduling shifts, dealing with paperwork, all those things that foremen have to do.
It's not an easy job.
So he's reached his level of incompetence. He's stuck.
He's stuck.
And the craziest part is, the book says this happens all the time.
All the time.
Okay, but hold on. What about those people who seem to be killing it at the top? Surely they're not incompetent, right?
Well, the book tackles that question, too. And this is where it gets even more interesting. It talks about these apparent exceptions to the Peter Principle, and one of them is called percussive sublimation.
Percussive sublimation. Now that sounds fancy.
It does, but it basically means someone gets kicked upstairs, promoted to a higher position, not because they're good, but to get them out of the way.
So like if you have a coworker who's always messing things up, but they're friends with the boss, suddenly they get promoted to like some vague-sounding executive role with no real responsibilities.
Exactly.
So it's like moving the problem instead of actually solving it.
It is.
And the book points out that this creates a whole layer of uselessness at the top. People who are basically just taking up space and looking important.
That sounds about right. And then there's lateral arabesque, which is even more ridiculous. This is where an incompetent employee gets a fancy title, a bigger office, maybe even a company car, but absolutely no increase in responsibility.
So they aren't actually getting promoted. They're just getting shuffled around to make it look like they're valuable.
It's all about appearances, not actual competence. And then there's Peter's inversion, which is something I bet we've all experienced at some point.
Oh, I'm sure.
This is where people focus so much on following rules and procedures that they completely forget about the actual goal that they're supposed to be achieving.
Like when you're stuck in a frustrating bureaucratic situation, you need to get a document stamped. But the person behind the desk insists on following every single rule.
Even though it makes things take forever
Yeah.
and doesn't actually help anyone.
That's Peter's inversion in action.
It is.
People become so obsessed with the how that they forget about the why.
And ironically, the book argues that this kind of behavior often gets rewarded in hierarchies because it's seen as a form of obedience.
So people who are really good at following rules, even if they aren't good at their jobs, can end up getting promoted, which just perpetuates the cycle of incompetence.
Exactly.
But wait, there's one more parent exception that's maybe the most shocking of all. Hierarchical exfoliation.
This one's wild. It's when people are fired for being too good at their jobs.
Fired for being too good. They're so competent they disrupt the whole system.
The book tells this story about a teacher who was fired. Because her students were getting too good at reading, they were outperforming other classes and causing all sorts of problems.
Because if you've got someone who's constantly exceeding expectations, it can make everyone else look bad.
And it might even challenge the way things have always been done, which some people find very threatening.
So even though it seems counterintuitive, the authors argue that hierarchical exfoliation is another way the Peter Principle plays out. It's like the system is designed to reward mediocrity and punish excellence.
That's a scary thought.
Now, all this talk about how people get stuck at their level of incompetence, it raises a big question. How do they climb the hierarchy in the first place?
How do they even get there?
And the book breaks it down into two main forces, push and pull. Push is all about that internal drive, ambition, hard work, the desire to climb the ladder. It's that go-getter attitude that pushes people upward.
That makes sense.
But here's the catch. Push doesn't necessarily guarantee competence at a higher level.
You could be a fantastic worker bee, the best at what you do,
Yeah.
but a terrible manager once you're promoted.
And then there's pull, which is all about those external factors that can help you get ahead. Connections, knowing the right people, maybe even a little bit of luck.
It's the who you know factor.
It really is.
The book tells this great story about a guy named Harker who got promoted to music supervisor, even though he was hard of hearing.
Hard to hear.
Why? Because he was the superintendent's son-in-law.
Nepotism at its finest.
Nepotism.
But whether it's push or pull, the book argues that the end result is often the same. People getting promoted to positions they aren't actually equipped to handle.
Right. They just aren't ready for it.
And that brings us to one of the book's most thought-provoking points. The idea that incompetence is everywhere.
Everywhere.
We aren't just talking about a few bad apples. They're saying it's a widespread phenomenon that affects everything, from politics and government to education and even the arts.
And the book is full of these hilarious anecdotes that illustrate just how absurd things can get when incompetent people are in charge. Like there's the story about the British Navy back in 1684.
The British Navy.
Which was apparently a complete mess.
Oh.
Some of the warships were so poorly built that they would have sunk at their moorings if they hadn't been quickly repaired.
Oh my goodness.
And then there's this report about an Australian hospital ship where someone had painted the inside of the water tanks with red lead.
Red lead.
Yeah.
Talk about a health hazard.
It just goes to show that incompetence has been around forever, and it can pop up in the most unexpected places.
So true. Okay, but this is where the book takes a bit of a serious turn. It introduces the idea of something called final placement syndrome, which is basically a set of physical and psychological symptoms that can arise when you're stuck at your level of incompetence.
This isn't meant to be a medical diagnosis or anything, but it is interesting to think about how the stress and frustration of being in a job you can't handle can affect your health.
It can really take a toll. The book talks about things like ulcers, high blood pressure, insomnia, even excessive sweating. Wow. They call it final placement syndrome because it's like your body and mind are rebelling against being in a position that's not right for you.
It makes sense.
It's a good reminder that your career choices can have a real impact on your well-being.
They really can.
So you might be wondering, is there any hope? Is there a way to avoid all this?
Well, luckily for us, the book offers some solutions, and some of them are actually pretty funny.
Oh, so there's hope. We'll dive into those in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned. Okay, so we've talked about how people get stuck at their level of incompetence, the push and pull that gets them there, and even the toll it can take on their health. But what about solutions? Is there a way to escape the clutches of the Peter Principle?
Well, the good news is the authors offer a few ideas, and some of them are pretty creative, maybe even a little sneaky. One of the most interesting concepts is creative incompetence. Basically, it's about intentionally displaying harmless incompetence to avoid getting promoted to a position you don't want.
So it's like playing dumb on purpose. But why would anyone want to do that?
Well, think about it. Maybe you love your current job, you're good at it, you have a great work-life balance, but you know if you keep excelling, you'll be pressured to move up. And you just don't want the extra responsibility, the longer hours, all the stress that comes with the higher position.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do you actually pull off creative incompetence without getting fired?
Well, the book suggests some pretty funny tactics. For example, you could try leaving your desk drawers open at the end of the day. Create a sense of disorganization. Or maybe you become overly thrifty, like turning off lights every time someone leaves a room. Or picking up every single paperclip off the floor.
I get to see how that could get annoying. It's like you're sending a subtle message. Not exactly management material.
Exactly. You're creating a little bit of doubt, a slight air of eccentricity, just enough to make your superiors think twice about promoting you.
So you're not actually incompetent. You're just strategically playing the game.
Right. You're protecting yourself from being promoted to a position that might make you miserable.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah.
But the Peter Principle isn't just about individuals navigating their careers. It also looks at how incompetence affects entire systems and organizations.
Right, we're zooming out to the bigger picture now.
Exactly. So what happens when incompetence becomes widespread? In a company, a government, even a whole society.
Well, the authors describe a phenomenon called hierarchical regression.
Hierarchical regression.
Basically, it's the idea that as more and more incompetent people get promoted, the overall standards of the hierarchy decline.
So it's like a downward spiral of mediocrity?
Yeah, exactly. They use the example of the education system, where pressure to push students through grades, regardless of their abilities, can lead to a devaluation of diplomas and degrees.
So high school diploma, or even a college degree, might not mean what it used to.
Right, and this can happen in any field, where promotions are based on things like seniority or connections, rather than actual competence.
So it's not just about what you know. It's about who you know and how long you've been around.
Sadly, yeah.
Okay, so that's hierarchical regression. What other big picture problems do they talk about?
Well, they also address computerized incompetence, which is super relevant today.
Computerized incompetence.
The authors argue that while computers were meant to increase efficiency, they can actually amplify incompetence when people rely on them blindly, without understanding their limitations.
It's like that old saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. If you feed a computer bad data or unclear instructions, you're going to get bad results. They tell a story about a company that bought a fancy new computer system to replace some of its staff, thinking it would streamline everything, but the owner was used to giving vague orders and having his employees figure out what he meant. The computer, of course, couldn't do that. It just followed his instructions literally, which led to all sorts of mistakes, and eventually the company went bankrupt.
Wow. So it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of technology in the wrong hands.
Right. It's a reminder that technology is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used effectively, or it can be misused. And if the people using it are incompetent, well, that's when things can really go wrong.
So we've got incompetence at the individual level, and now we've got it spreading to entire organizations and systems. It's starting to sound pretty bleak. Do the authors offer any hope for dealing with this on a larger scale?
They do. They have a whole section on Peter's remedies, which range from preventative measures to ways to mitigate the damage once incompetence has taken hold.
Okay, so let's start with prevention. What can organizations do to stop people from reaching their level of incompetence in the first place?
They call these preventative measures Peter's prophylactics.
Peter's prophylactics.
And they emphasize the importance of things like realistic goal setting, honest self-assessment, and matching people's skills to the right roles. They suggest that organizations should encourage employees to think critically about whether a promotion is actually something they want, or if they might be happier and more effective staying at their current level.
So it's about recognizing that upward mobility isn't the only path to success and fulfillment.
Exactly. And it's about organizations creating a culture where people feel valued for their competence, regardless of their position in the hierarchy.
I like that.
They also talk about using aptitude tests and other evaluation tools to assess people's skills and make sure they're being placed in roles where they're likely to thrive.
That makes sense. But even with the best preventative measures in place, there will always be some level of incompetence in any organization, right?
That's probably true.
So what about those Peter's palliatives you mentioned? The strategies for dealing with incompetence once it's already there?
Well, one of the more interesting suggestions is using those lateral arabesques we talked about earlier to move incompetent people into positions where they're less likely to do harm.
So instead of firing someone outright, you give them a fancy title and a bigger office, but no real responsibility.
Exactly. It's a way of neutralizing their incompetence without having to actually get rid of them. Of course, this isn't always the most ethical solution, but the authors present it as a pragmatic approach in certain situations.
Okay, so besides shuffling incompetent people around, what else can organizations do?
They also talk about the importance of creating systems and processes that minimize the potential for human error.
Systems and processes.
So things like checklists, clear instructions, built-in redundancies to catch mistakes before they become major problems.
So it's like creating a safety net to catch those inevitable moments of human fallibility.
Exactly. And finally, they emphasize the importance of having competent people at the top of hierarchies, folks who can make good decisions and set a positive example for the rest of the organization.
So it all comes back to leadership.
Right. The authors argue that competent leadership is essential for creating a culture of competence throughout the organization. They even suggest that the rise and fall of entire civilizations might be explained by the competence or incompetence of their leaders.
Wow, that's a pretty grand claim.
It is.
But it makes you think, doesn't it?
It definitely does. The book is full of these thought-provoking ideas, and they're presented with such a great mix of humor and insight that it's hard not to get caught up in the author's train of thought.
So we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to explore. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll look at the author's ultimate vision for a more competent world. All right, so we've been unpacking the Peter Principle and how it explains why things sometimes go wrong, from those little everyday frustrations to like major organizational meltdowns.
Yeah, it can get pretty serious.
But the book isn't just about pointing fingers at incompetent people. It's about finding solutions, right?
Absolutely. In fact, the authors offer a pretty hopeful vision for a more competent world.
They do.
They do. They call it Peter's prescription.
Peter's prescription.
And it goes beyond just fixing those individual problems. It
Right.
challenges us to rethink some of our fundamental assumptions about work success, even progress itself.
Okay, so let's dive into this Peter's prescription. Where do we even begin to create a world with less incompetence?
Well, the authors start by urging us to shift our focus from that constant pursuit of promotion to a more balanced view of work and life.
So it's not about climbing as high as you can.
Right. It's about finding a level where you're competent and content, even if it's not the highest rung on the ladder.
So it's about finding the right fit.
Exactly. It's about doing work that you enjoy, that you're good at, and that allows you to have a fulfilling life outside of work.
That makes a lot of sense. But it's hard in a world that constantly tells us to dream big and never give up.
It is. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that we always have to be striving for more, for bigger and better things.
That can be exhausting.
It can. And the authors suggest that this mindset can actually lead to unhappiness and frustration, especially if we're constantly reaching for things that are beyond our grasp.
So part of Peter's prescription is about being honest with ourselves, about what we're truly capable of, and what we actually want out of life.
Exactly. It's about defining success on our own terms, rather than letting society dictate what success should look like.
Okay, but this isn't just about individual fulfillment, right? The authors also talk about how this shift in mindset can benefit society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. They challenge us to rethink our obsession with growth and progress, especially when it comes to technology.
Oh, that's interesting.
They point out that while technology has brought us many amazing things, it's also created a lot of new problems, from environmental degradation to social inequality.
So it's about questioning whether all this progress is actually making the world a better place.
Right. They urge us to consider whether we might be better off, focusing on improving the quality of life for everyone, rather than just striving for more.
That's a big shift in thinking.
It is. It's a pretty radical idea, especially in our current economic system. But it's definitely one worth considering.
So it sounds like Peter's prescription is about finding a balance between individual fulfillment and societal well-being. But what does that look like in practice? What concrete steps can we take to create this more competent world?
Well, the authors offer a few specific suggestions. First, they emphasize the importance of education, but not just any kind of education.
And what kind of education?
They argue that we need to focus on teaching practical skills, critical thinking, problem solving, rather than just filling people's heads with facts and figures.
So it's about preparing people to be adaptable and resourceful, to think on their feet.
Exactly. And they also advocate for creating work environments that value competence and reward people for doing good work, rather than just promoting them based on seniority or connections.
Makes sense.
And they suggest implementing systems and processes that make it easier for people to do their jobs effectively and minimize the potential for errors.
It's like creating a support system for competence.
Exactly. And you know what else they suggest?
What's that?
Incorporating a bit of humor into the workplace as a way to reduce stress and boost morale.
Because laughter is the best medicine.
Right. It helps us to take ourselves a little less seriously and to see the absurdity in some of the situations we find ourselves in.
So in a nutshell, Peter's prescription is a call for a more thoughtful and humane approach to work and life. It's about recognizing that competence is valuable, that happiness doesn't always come from climbing the ladder, and that maybe, just maybe, we can create a world where things work a little bit better.
A world with less incompetence.
That sounds pretty good to me. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Peter Principle. It's a funny, insightful, and surprisingly relevant book, even after all these years. And if you're interested in learning more about these ideas, we highly recommend checking out the full book. And be sure to subscribe to Too Lazy to Read for more deep dives into fascinating books that you might be well too lazy to read yourself. Thanks for listening.